We've all been there. Nostalgic for a game that defined our childhood or a classic title that holds a special place in gaming history. But when you go back and play it, the controls feel outdated, the graphics look rough, or maybe it just doesn't hold up like you remembered. That's where remakes and remasters come in. They bring old favorites back to life with a fresh coat of paint, sometimes even reimagining the whole experience for a modern audience. But not all remakes and remasters are created equal. Some enhance the original in all the right ways, while others miss the mark. In this video, we're diving into 5 of the best retro game remakes and remasters that have successfully balanced nostalgia with innovation. From visual overhauls to gameplay tweaks, these are the titles that manage to capture the magic of their originals, while offering something new for both veterans and new players alike. But here's the catch. Just because the game gets a facelift doesn't mean it always works. Sometimes, the line between remake and ruining the original can be razor thin. So let's break down the 5 best retro game remakes ranked from the good to the absolute game changer. When Shadow of the Colossus originally launched in 2005 on the PlayStation 2, it was hailed as a masterpiece. A haunting, minimalist tale of love, sacrifice, and consequence wrapped in one of the most unique gameplay loops of its time. It wasn't just a game, it was an experience. But let's be real, even the most die-hard fans will admit the original was far from perfect. The controls were clunky, the camera fought you at every turn, and the frame rate sometimes struggled under the PS2's hardware limitations. Enter Bluepoint Games in 2018 with a remake that sought to preserve the soul of the original while giving it a much-needed overhaul. The first thing you notice about the remake is its stunning visual transformation. Bluepoint rebuilt Shadow of the Colossus from the ground up, and it shows. Gone are the low-res textures and jagged edges of the PlayStation 2 version. Instead, we're treated to a sprawling landscape with jaw-dropping details, rolling fields of grass swaying in the wind, crumbling ancient ruins bathed in sunlight, and colossi that feel more like living, breathing creatures than ever before. The lighting, the water effects, the sheer scale, it's breathtaking. And all of it runs smoothly on modern hardware, a far cry from the technical struggles of the original. But it's not just about the visuals. Bluepoint also made subtle tweaks to the gameplay, which, let's be honest, was a bit of a divisive point in the original. The controls were reworked to feel more intuitive and responsive, making climbing and battling the colossi less frustrating while still maintaining the tension and challenge that fans loved. If you're a purist, don't worry. You can switch back to the original control scheme, which is a nice nod to longtime fans. The audio design also got a boost, with enhanced sound effects and remastered versions of Ko Otani's iconic score. The soundtrack, man, it's still one of the best in gaming, and hearing it with such clarity adds a whole new layer of immersion. Every note hits harder, every swell of the orchestra feels grander, and it amplifies the emotional weight of the story. Now here's the thing, while this remake is stunning, some argue it loses a bit of the original's raw, almost dreamlike aesthetic. The muted, foggy visuals of the PS2 version had a certain mystique, a sense of mystery that made the world feel otherworldly and ancient. The remake's hyper-detailed environments, while gorgeous, can sometimes feel a little too clean and polished. It's a trade-off, and whether it's for better or for worse is on your personal preference. At its core, though, the 2018 Shadow of Colossus remake is a love letter to the original, a faithful recreation that smooths out its rough edges while enhancing its beauty for a new generation. It's not perfect, but it's an undeniable triumph in preserving a classic for modern audiences. Landing at number 4, we have the Resident Evil 2 remake. When Capcom announced they were remaking this game, fans were equal parts thrilled and skeptical. After all, the 1998 original isn't just a classic, it's a cornerstone of survival horror. How do you rework a game that defined a genre without alienating its core audience? Well, Capcom didn't just pull it off, they knocked it out of the park. The first thing to understand about Resident Evil 2 Remake is that it's not just a prettier version of the original. This is a full-blown reimagining. Capcom rebuilt the game from scratch using their proprietary RE engine, and the result is stunning. The fixed camera angles of the original have been replaced with an over-the-shoulder perspective, similar to Resident Evil 4. This change alone completely alters the gameplay, making it more immersive and, frankly, more terrifying. The claustrophobic hallways of the Raccoon City Police Department feel more oppressive than ever, with dynamic lighting and shadows that constantly play tricks on your mind. Speaking of terror, let's talk about the zombies. These aren't the cannon fodder enemies you remember from the original. In the remake, zombies are tanky, relentless, and downright horrifying. Every encounter feels like a life or death struggle. You can pump an entire clip into one and still not be sure it's staying down. The gore system is incredibly detailed. Shot placement matters, and watching flesh and bone get blown away in gruesome detail is equal parts impressive and disturbing. This isn't just a graphical upgrade. It fundamentally changes how you approach combat and resource management. The puzzles and level design have also been reworked to feel fresh while staying true to the spirit of the original. Key items and pathways have been shuffled around, keeping even veteran players on their toes. The game also expands on its narrative, adding depth to characters like Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield, who now feel more like real people than archetypes. Even minor characters like Marvin Branagh get their moments to shine, making the story hit harder emotionally. Then there's Mr. X. In the original game, he was a scripted nuisance that popped up occasionally to keep you on edge. In the remake, he has been transformed into a persistent, unstoppable force of nature. You'll hear his heavy footsteps echoing through the halls, and the sheer anxiety of not knowing when or where he'll appear is enough to make you freeze mid-puzzle. He's the perfect representation of what makes this remake so effective. It's not just about nostalgia, it's about reinventing the horror. Now, as much as there is to love, not everything is perfect. Some purists miss the fixed camera angles, while they argue they were part of the original's charm and added to the tension. The over-the-shoulder view, while more modern and accessible, shifts the balance of the game closer to the action than pure survival horror. But these changes feel deliberate, aiming to strike a balance between paying homage to the original and making it accessible to new audiences. In the end, Resident Evil 2 isn't just a remake, it's a reinvention. It honors the legacy of the original while carving out its own identity, standing as one of the best examples of how to bring a retro classic into the modern era. Coming in at number 3, we have the beloved Final Fantasy VII Remake. As it stands, this game is one of the most iconic of all time. When it launched in 1997, it redefined what a JRPG could be, introducing millions of players to a sprawling story full of unforgettable characters, emotional depth, and an immersive world. So when Square Enix announced they were making it, expectations were through the roof. And so was skepticism. After all, how do you remake a game that's practically sacred? Square Enix's answer: don't just remake it, reimagine it. Unlike the other entries on this list, Final Fantasy VII Remake isn't a one-to-one recreation. It's the first part of an episodic series, focusing entirely on the Midgar portion of the game. What was a 5-hour introduction in 1997 has been expanded into a full 30 to 40-hour experience. This decision could have easily backfired, but Square Enix packed Midgar with so much detail, so many new storylines, and so much life that it feels like a standalone game. Let's start with the visuals. Midgar, in the original, was iconic, but it was also contained by the hardware of its time. In the remake, the city feels alive. Gritty slums, bustling markets, and towering industry structures all come together to create a setting that's as immersive as it is awe-inspiring. Every environment, from the neon-soaked streets of Wall Market to the eerie Mako reactors, is brought to life with meticulous detail. The characters too look phenomenal. Cloud, Tifa, Barrett, and Aerith aren't just pixelated avatars anymore. They're fully realized, emotionally expressive characters that feel more real than ever. Of course, visuals are only part of the equation. The biggest change is the combat system. Gone is the classic turn-based active time battle, or ATB system, replaced with a hybrid real-time and tactical combat system. You'll control one character directly in real time, dodging, blocking, and attacking, while still being able to pause the action to issue commands to your party. This blend of action and strategy keeps combat engaging and fast-paced without abandoning the strategic depth fans loved in the original. Each character plays differently. Cloud is your versatile sword wielder, Tifa is all about fast, hard-hitting combos, and Barrett brings ranged firepower. This variety ensures you're constantly switching tactics based on the enemies you're facing. Now, let's talk story. This is where the remake gets pretty bold. While it follows the general framework of the original, it also takes creative liberties, adding new subplots, fleshing out side characters, and expanding on themes that were only hinted at before. Without diving into spoilers, it's safe to say the narrative goes into unexpected directions, sometimes to the delight of fans, sometimes to their frustration. But love it or hate it, there's no denying Square Enix took risks, and those risks make the experience feel fresh and unpredictable, even for those who know the original by heart. However, this remake isn't without its flaws. The pacing drags in places, with some sections feeling padded with unnecessary fetch quests. And the narrative changes, while bold, may not sit well with purists who wanted a more faithful retelling. But these criticisms are minor compared to the overall achievement of this remake. Whether you're a longtime fan or a newcomer, it's an unforgettable experience that captures the spirit of the original while carving out a new legacy of its own. Taking over our number 2 spot is The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. Originally released in 1993 for the Game Boy, this game was an oddball in the franchise. A quirky, dreamlike adventure set on Koholint Island rather than Hyrule. Despite its humble origins on Nintendo's tiny monochrome handheld, it quickly became a fan favorite, thanks to its unique story, offbeat humor, and tight gameplay. The 29 remake for the Nintendo Switch didn't just recreate this classic, it lovingly brought it into the modern era while keeping its eccentric soul intact. The most striking change is immediately obvious: the visuals. Nintendo and Grezzo reimagined the game with a bold, toy-like art style that feels whimsical and fresh. The tilt-shift perspective, combined with soft lighting and charmingly exaggerated character design, makes Koholint Island feel like a living diorama. Each area is bursting with vibrant colors and intricate details, from the quaint Mabe village to the eerie halls of the Color Dungeon. The choice to go with this aesthetic could have been polarizing, but it perfectly captures the surreal, dreamlike tone of the original while giving the game its own modern identity. But Link's Awakening isn't just about looks. Nintendo updated the gameplay to fit modern standards without sacrificing the design principles that made the original great. Movement is now fluid, untethered from the grid-like restrictions of the Game Boy's hardware. Swapping items is far less cumbersome thanks to the Switch's additional buttons. You no longer have to constantly dive into the menus to equip basic items like the sword or shield. These quality-of-life improvements make exploration and combat smoother and more enjoyable, letting players focus on the adventure itself rather than fumbling with outdated mechanics. And speaking of the adventure, the remake stays incredibly faithful to the original structure. All the dungeons are there, complete with their clever puzzles and memorable bosses. But Grezzo didn't stop with just recreating the classic. They also included some thoughtful extras. For example, the new Chamber Dungeon feature lets players create their own custom dungeons by arranging pre-existing room layouts. While it's not quite Zelda Maker, it's a fun addition for players who want to experiment with the game's mechanics. However, the remake isn't without some minor flaws. The new visuals, while beautiful, introduced occasional frame rate dips, particularly in busier areas. It's not game-breaking, but it's noticeable enough to disrupt the otherwise smooth experience. Additionally, some fans may have hoped for a more substantially new content beyond the Chamber Dungeon feature, as the core game is essentially a one-to-one recreation of the original. Still, what Link's Awakening does, it does it masterfully. It doesn't try to reinvent the wheel, but instead polishes it to a brilliant shine. It's a love letter to one of gaming's most unique and beloved classics, capturing everything that made the original special while adding just enough modern touches to make it accessible for a new generation. And awarded our number 1 spot is Metroid: Samus Returns. At first glance, Metroid 2: Return of Samus for the Game Boy doesn't look like the most obvious candidate for a remake. Released in 1991, it was a groundbreaking game for its time, pushing the limits of Nintendo's handheld system with its ambitious exploration-based gameplay. But it was also constrained by the hardware. Limited visuals, no in-game map, and a repetitive design that made it feel like a diamond in the rough compared to its successor, Super Metroid. In 2017, Nintendo and Mercury Stream took on the challenge of reimagining this classic with Metroid: Samus Returns for the 3DS, and the result was nothing short of spectacular. The first thing Samus Returns does right is modernizing the gameplay. The original's methodical pacing has been upgraded to match the faster, more fluid combat style of later Metroid games. Samus now has access to a suite of new moves that feel both intuitive and empowering. Chief among them is the melee counter, a quick reactive strike that allows players to deflect enemy attacks and counter with a devastating follow-up shot. At first it feels like a flashy gimmick, but it quickly becomes an essential part of the combat loop, adding a satisfying rhythm to the encounters. Samus also gains new Aeon abilities. a suite of powers that enhance exploration and combat. For example, the Scan Pulse reveals hidden breakable blocks, addressing one of the original game's more frustrating aspects, having to blindly shoot at every surface in hope of uncovering a secret. These additions streamline the game without sacrificing its core identity and an exploration-driven adventure. The new abilities strike a delicate balance. They make the game more accessible for newcomers while still demanding skill and resource management for veteran players. Visually, Samus Returns is a massive leap forward. Mercury Stream crafted a stunning 2.5D world that retains the series' eerie atmosphere while bringing it to life with vibrant colors and dynamic lighting effects. The environments feel more distinct and varied, with each area of the SR-388, the alien planet where the game takes place, bursting with personality. From the molten depths of the magma caverns to the lush, overgrown vegetation of the jungle ruins, every zone feels handcrafted and alive. The animations are fluid as well, giving Samus a sense of power and grace that elevates her iconic status as one of the game's greatest protagonists. In the end, Metroid Samus Returns isn't just a great remake, it's a love letter to the fans of the franchise, and a masterclass in how to breathe new life into a retro game while staying true to its roots. It's everything a Metroid remake should be: challenging, atmospheric, and unforgettable.
We spend a lot of time going back through design notes and art direction.
And there you have it, 5 retro game remakes that prove not all nostalgia trips are created equal. Whether it's battling towering Colossi, dodging Mr. X's size 15 boots, or re-exploring the depths of SR-388 with a shiny new arsenal, these games didn't just crash in on nostalgia, they elevated it. They're the pixel-perfect proof that remakes don't have to be lazy, they can be a chance to refine, reimagine, and remind us why we fell in love with these games in the first place. So what do you think? Did we get it right? Or are you sharpening your keyboard for an angry comment about why Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled should have made the list? Let us know below. In the meantime, I'm off to replay Resident Evil 2, because there's nothing like watching Leon Kennedy sprint for his life while I sip coffee and pretend I could survive a zombie apocalypse. Spoiler alert, I couldn't. If you enjoyed exploring the top 5 best retro game remakes of all time, click this video here to see more from the Retro Reload. And, as always, thank you for watching.